Most of the chatter that goes on about social justice in the teaching English as a second language field tends to follow traditionally postmodern lines. And it's good to be able to work within the postmodern framework if you recognize that there's this tendency to replace one hierarchy with another. So I'd be far more skeptical than probably a lot of my colleagues about the role of Davos to influence policy. Teaching English as a second language, or TESOL, as those in the field call it, is not a politically neutral activity. And now there's agreement about this. Education, by its very nature, is political. So far, so good. When it comes to teaching English around the world, those who come from English-speaking countries are part of the globalized marketplace, which has created a demand for English opportunity and English learning. And there's a special responsibility. As such, too, we have the special responsibility and the unique opportunity to present the cultures we come from, as well as to be a voice for the voiceless in the cultures where we are. And around the world, where the countries we teach English in are often on the front lines of globalization, on the front lines of battles for political control versus national sovereignty, where political leaders appeal to globalized institutions to justify present policies. The English teacher is a political subject, for better or for worse, whether acknowledged or unacknowledged. In Latin America, in Ecuador, where I teach, traditionally there have been two ways to approach power. And I think this is pretty much across the board. One has to embrace the United States and to follow blindly its lead no matter what. The current president of Ecuador, Daniel Noboa, as well as the last president of Ecuador, Lasso, were examples of this. Daniel Noboa comes from Ecuador's wealthiest family, speaks fluent English, and goes to Washington, D.C. and presents himself as being an American good old boy. The other tendency is to resist the imperialismo Yankee, as they call it. This tendency is more with politicians on the left. They instinctively look for alternatives to the Washington consensus, and so understandably put a lot more trust and show a lot more fidelity and loyalty to international institutions as an alternative to the United States, and look to bring their countries into international agreements, climate treaties, World Health Organization treaties, etc. The current president of Colombia, Petros, is a good example of this second tendency. I mean, he was a communist, but now he's walking the halls of the United Nations. And I'm going to argue that these international institutions now, they form a de facto world government. We could also name Rafael Correa, the former left-wing strongman of Ecuador, and those aligned with his political movement as part of the second tendency. Both of these tendencies, though, if you want to think of it in terms of left versus right, nationalism versus globalism, or whatever, both of these fail to address the fundamental threats of globalization. And in the second case, only replace one hierarchy for another, thus keeping the colonial structure in place. So where Daniel Noboa goes to Washington, Petros of Colombia goes to Davos, where the World Economic Forum meets once a year. My thesis here is that we cannot escape the English teacher being a political actor, and that the idea of a politically neutral English teacher is a myth, that by hook or by crook we will have a political philosophy that will be conveyed in a multitude of ways. Think of it in terms of a direct or an indirect political philosophy. The guiding political philosophy today is globalism and transhumanism. This is very clear when looking at the English textbooks put out by Cambridge University Press, which has enormous control over the messaging of ESL classrooms the world over. My contention is that if we do not have a direct philosophy, we will, by default, resort to an implicit philosophy, one that isn't thought of as being necessarily political, may just be considered good science or sound education, An example of this is the Agenda 2030 benchmark that has set educational goals around the world. Students are being indoctrinated with the United Nations goals of deindustrialization. Deindustrialization, the limits to growth, ironically called sustainable development under the guise of environmentalism. However, if we're going to get out of this cycle of the environmental crisis, it's through innovation and through industry that we're going to get out of it. For example, I grew up in Humboldt County, California, where I saw these ideological battles played out in front of my eyes because of the redwood trees. It's been a center for environmentalism for a long time. There's a lot of controversy about cutting down trees for using paper, for making paper, but they don't talk about the fact that the United States almost had a hemp-based sustainable economy. But there were those at the time working with the production of synthetic products, fibers from petroleum products that were threatened by the reemergence of hemp. So sometimes the solutions are staring us in our face, but while we have these, because we can obviously, instead of cutting down trees to make paper, we can use hemp. But as long as we have the deindustrialization and a philosophy and laws in place that limit growth, we can't have the real alternatives. And we're going so fast now with this idea of progress and evolution that we overlook real discoveries in medicine and science. For example, German New Medicine and the 5 biological laws. Everything is now, that's overlooked because everything now is digitized. And computers can't self-correct. And so the treatment plans for different diseases are now generated by AI. So when there are really game-changing discoveries, they're not incorporated into our new models. We need to see the deindustrialization, the limits to growth, not as environmentalism, but as colonialism. We have gone so far down the road of the hijack narrative that sadly, most English teachers now aren't even aware of the major threats facing their countries and the world. Geoengineering, for example, which is climate modification by militaries. Some of it, like cloud seeding in Dubai, we've heard of. But, Operation Popeye during the Vietnam War that extended the monsoon season and flooded the trail known by the traveled by the communists, the tidal wave bombs in World War II. A lot of this, we have heard about it, but a lot of it too is very controversial. The idea of the overhead spraying and the fumigation of our cities. And it's having a disastrous effect on ecosystems around the world. I suggest everybody go to geoengineeringwatch.org. But it's not a conversation that we're allowed to have in polite society, any more than the question of false flag terrorism is, and who was really behind the terrorist events in New York and London and Madrid, even though there's a lot of evidence that these were propaganda operations by the great powers, great power politics. Textbooks repeat and strengthen the status quo. Even for children, they're pushing geoengineering. And we prioritize, it's sold as there's this crisis of climate change and we have to have a technological fix. So what better way than to spray chemicals to block out the sun? And they don't talk about the fact that there's this kind of circular reasoning that goes on because this has been going on since the debate about climate change began in earnest. We prioritize narratives based on political assumptions. And in my work with AIDS and my AIDS Foundation, I've seen how there could be an enormous amount of work done by very competent scientists and the highest minds in biology. And keeping them out of print and out of the public light is a small miracle of censorship. But how can we continue to act as if these narratives are monolithic? When you try and talk about these things, I've noticed that I bump up against the idea that science is homogeneous, that there's no real scientific debate here, there's no question here, settle science. Whereas rather than challenging the narrative directly First, I just like the other to know that there are experts on both sides. Then only then one could actually look at what the alternatives voices are saying. But most people, they don't even know that there's a debate. So we have this idea of education as an unmasking of the hijacked narrative. I think most people in my field would agree that there is a social responsibility on the educator to unmask hierarchies and to resist colonialism. So far, so good. But we disagree about what the hijacked narratives are. And I see the education as an opportunity to raise these questions. And I don't know if you all have heard about the court case in Germany between 2013 and 2017 on the subject of measles, where Dr. Stefan Lanka put the technique that they use to culture viruses in test tubes and get their so-called genetic measurements, create vaccines and write papers and so on. He put this into the crosshairs, and they had expert witnesses come and testify, and the judge ruled there was no evidence that measles existed. And it put into question that any virus, because all the viruses follow this technique of the test tube. So if viruses don't exist, we have to ask what makes people sick and why do we close down the world for nothing? So a question I would have for everyone, and this is at the heart of the role of the English teacher, if it is true that there are massive crimes in high places which have taken the narratives hostage, holding narratives hostage, to what extent would that involve the ordinary person in an obligation for political activity? The implications are radical. I think we'd all agree in principle that the ordinary person has a responsibility to resist extreme oppression. The question that maybe we don't agree about is, what is that extreme oppression? But it's hard to have a conversation about that when the other side won't look at the evidence. Biotech students have sat in my classes, and they have had a very optimistic view of genetically modified food. Not all of them, but some of them. They've gone through the university programs and are totally unaware of the science that questions the safety of genetically modified organisms or the risk of monoculture. And I've heard them dismiss these concerns as fake or ungrounded. The English teacher will encounter the upper echelons of a country's society. Often they're most educated people, professionals and heads of organizations, teachers at universities, laboratory assistants, laboratory heads. Maybe we should think of planting seeds and challenging narratives, identifying the new colonialism, which is a lot like the old colonialism, but dressed up as globalization or good science, albeit science held hostage to a political agenda. During the 20th century, there were a lot of coups and dictatorships in Latin America. Most of those happened against the backdrop of the Cold War, where the phantom menace of communism was used as a pretext to stifle democratic movements. The ghost of communism has disappeared, yet still there's the threat of military dictatorships that can close down whole societies and suspend democratic norms and shred constitutional liberties. We're facing a debate in Ecuador, as other countries have faced recently, about the gangs which are dedicated to narco-trafficking. And maybe it's time to have a conversation about how presidents of the United States have been directly involved with narco-trafficking and the complicity of groups like the Drug Enforcement Agency, because the tendency is to turn to these people for help without seeing that they're also part of the problem. The health circus that happened in 2020 under questionable science is a great example. I was having a conversation with a woman the other day who said she wasn't religious but spiritual. I said there is something intrinsic in humanity that looks for authority and leaders, where the traditional religions of the past take a back seat in society. A new priest system, a new priest class emerges, maybe this time with the white suits, and the ministries of health. This time it's clothed in science, scientism, as Carl Stearns called it. It's not real science. It has the trapping of science, but it's a death cult. Since I was reading the internal documents of the elite, I knew that after the failed swine flu fiasco of 2012, they regrouped and they spent the next 8 years planning how to have a pandemic meticulously. But for most people, it just seemed to have come out of nowhere. How many times I heard, or you heard, nobody could have foreseen this. And this had a huge impact on education. That's undeniable. So the teacher is, like it or not, involved in politics. The so-called pandemic was about politics. It wasn't about health. Once we recognize that the teacher has the power to carry out or to resist political pretexts and political oppression, we can accept the role and accept that responsibility. The teacher as a radical subject in the Heideggerian sense. Maybe you teach online because it's the law. Maybe you say you don't agree. Maybe you do agree. You're agreeing or disagreeing by acquiescing or by the subtle ways that you approach it. But if you say you think that we shouldn't be teaching online and that this is about something else, it would probably be the first time in a lot of these cases, I'm sure it would be the first time, that students heard an alternative viewpoint to the circumstances that are happening around them. Maybe you say, well, it's not for health, it's for political pretexts. In this sense, somebody coming from an English-speaking country definitely has an advantage, because in America, in England, in New Zealand, there are alternative sources of information. Even if most people don't use them, at least it is there. Whereas the press in the countries they will be teaching in is almost guaranteed to be monolithic. That's just a fact. That it's like the 1950s in a lot of ways, how the United States or England was in the 1950s. The countries that should be resisting colonialism are the ones who are most brainwashed. So think about the teacher as a subject, the radical subject, where social change starts with the individual and then spreads out in circles and waves, training the next generation by planting seeds. We don't know until we try. Those who say that social change isn't possible, they haven't seen the power that can happen when people unite. There are more of us than there are of the elites, and the elites are terrified that we will realize the power we hold in our hands. But it starts with the individual, and it starts in the classroom.